Okay, hi, and how are y'all doing? You can't answer that back, so I know that, but nevertheless, hope you're well. This folder is going to go into a couple of things. We're going to be looking at the relationship between Britain and its colonies as that relationship worked for about 150 years before you start to see the American colonies inching toward independence. And the second video that I'll be adding for this folder will deal with the defining events that will lead directly to independence and the revolution and the creation of the United States. First thing I want to do, though, is just talk a bit about some terminology. When we've been talking about the colonies, we've noted that those colonies that we've been looking at were established by England. And this is true. England was an independent nation, as was Wales right next door to it, as was Scotland to the north. But in 1707, the nations of England and Scotland and Wales unified to become one nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So during this period of time of colonial American history, you see England and Britain kind of being used interchangeably. But technically, in the 1600s, we're talking about England as the so-called mother country. After 1707, it's Great Britain, or just Britain, that we refer to as that mother country. So just be aware. England essentially equals Britain. Britain essentially can also refer to Britain. All right, so with that in place, probably more than you ever wanted to know, actually. Let's move on. In the second video, we're going to talk about what goes wrong between Britain and its colonies that leads to independence and the creation of the United States. But what we want to do today is understand what worked. Because for 150 years, right, for 150 years, from the early 1600s until the 1770s, this relationship between Britain and the colonies worked fairly well. It's not perfect, not by a long shot. But to understand what goes wrong in the relationship, we have to understand first how it worked. So we're going to talk a bit about the economic relationship between Britain, or England, and its colonies, because it's very different from the type of economic system, for example, of capitalism that we're used to today. Let's understand that Britain, and actually all nations in Europe in the 1600s, were committed to an economic system known as mercantilism. Mercantilism. And again, it's just simply a way to organize your economy. Today most nations operate under the basic ideas of capitalism. Socialism is another way to organize an economy. Mercantilism is the most common in the 1700s. We're not going to go into the dirty details of mercantilism, but I want to outline some basic ideas on which this system is built. So number one, according to mercantilist theory, the economic goal of a nation is to become as economically self-sufficient as possible. Mercantilist nations want to avoid having to buy very much from other nations. They don't want to have to depend on goods from other nations that are vital to their economy. And you can think today about oil, right? Many nations are most nations are very much dependent on foreign oil. That's something that a mercantilist would abhor, They do not want to have to be economically dependent on something so important to their economy that they themselves cannot produce. So the basic goal then of mercantilist nations is to discourage the importation of foreign goods into Britain for sale, but to encourage the exportation of British goods out to other nations. Now, you may not want to be economically dependent on another nation for products that are important to your economy, but you sure would love it if they were dependent on you, right? So mercantilism values exports of their goods out for sale in other nations and tries to discourage imports into their nation from abroad. And the second thing we want to understand about mercantilism explains why. Under a mercantilist system, the most important form of competition is not competition between businesses. It's competition between nations. Your rivals are not, the business down the street that does the same thing you do. In a mercantilist system, your rival is another country, because they believe that there's only so much wealth out there available in the world for nations. And the goal of a mercantilist nation is to get as much of that world wealth into your nation as you possibly can, right? So if you're buying too much, say from France, then that's too much of your British money going into your rival, your competitor of France. You want to keep as much as your money, as much of your wealth within your nation as you possibly can. One nation's loss is another nation's gain. You're competing with other nations for wealth under this system. You with me? More or less. You're never going to have to give this back to me. But essentially, we're talking that mercantilism stresses economic self-sufficiency. Don't want to have to buy very much from other nations. You'd rather sell your goods to them, because nations are competing with each other for this fixed amount of wealth that they believe is out there in the world. One nation's loss is another nation's gain. Third point, if it's all going to work right, if it's going to work to the benefit of your nation, then mercantilism requires that a nation control and direct all of the economic activities within its borders. There's got to be rules and regulations in place, right? You want to keep as much of that money in your pockets as you possibly can. You're going to have to make rules and regs that will benefit your economy, that will ensure that as much of that money comes into your pockets as possible. With me? Okay. So how do colonies fit into this? Actually, this whole system of mercantilism is really what leads to European, excuse me, sorry, I swallowed something wrong. Hold on just a second, let me drink some water. This whole system of mercantilism really encourages powerful nations to have colonies. They benefit a lot from colonies, so let's see what they do. Colonies are important in mercantilism because colonies can supply the mother country with resources that they don't have at home. If they weren't buying, say, tobacco or sugar or even lumber from their colonies in America, they might have to buy those things from, say, Spain, maybe, or France. And you don't want to do that, right? Because that's your money going into the pockets of one of your rival nations. So the colonies, which are growing lots and lots of raw materials, and the tobacco in Virginia, rice, cutting down trees for lumber, sugar, that will benefit Britain. And send those raw materials to Britain to be used in manufacturing finished products. And second, the colonies are also important because they are a market for British manufactured goods. And you want your colonies to purchase manufactured goods from your nation, not somebody else, not from France, not from Spain. And so as the colonies buy British manufactured goods, they're helping to keep the British money, as it were, in the family. They're not enriching those other nations. And what Britain wants out of this arrangement is not at all incompatible with what the colonies need and want. Because the colonists need a market for the raw materials, for the raw goods that they are growing in America. Again, the tobacco, the later cotton, sugar, etc. But the colonies also need a cheap source of manufactured goods, because the colonies are simply not at the point in their development where they have factories, where they're industrialized. They are simply at the beginnings, really, of creating an economy, and it's based on agriculture. And so Britain supplies the manufactured goods that people need in the colonies. The colony produces the raw materials to help Britain manufacture those goods. And this relationship then is mutually beneficial to both Britain and to the colonies. The mother country buys raw materials from the colonies. The colonies buy manufactured goods from the mother country. Nevertheless, if this relationship is going to benefit Britain to the max, and again, that's what the purpose of this system is, to benefit Britain. If this relationship is going to benefit Britain, then guidance and control is necessary over colonial economic activities. If mercantilism is going to work right, you're going to have to try to make sure that those colonies aren't selling their raw materials to one of your rival nations. What if they're selling their tobacco not to Britain but to France? What if those colonies decide that they're going to buy manufactured goods not from Britain but from Spain? What if those colonies are growing something that Britain doesn't even need? There's got to be rules. There's got to be regulations. If Britain is to benefit fully from this mercantilist system, from having colonies, there's got to be continuous supervision, regulation, rules, guiding and directing the economic activities of the colonies. And the fact that Britain had the right to control the colonies' economic activities is never in question. I mean, everyone knows how this system works. Everyone expects there to be regulations. The problem is going to be, though, that from the beginning of British colonization in North America, all the way back to the 1600s, Britain is slow and inconsistent in setting up effective policies to regulate colonial trade. And when they do get around to setting up the rules, they didn't enforce them very well. And as a result, we're going to see a certain sense of economic freedom forming in the colonies. So, Why didn't Britain immediately upon establishing colonies set up the rules to regulate colonial trade? Fact of the matter is, when Britain was beginning to establish these colonies in the early 1600s, there is a great deal of political and religious chaos brewing in what was then England. In 1640, a civil war breaks out in England. The monarchy is overthrown. King Charles I is going to be beheaded. For 20 years, there is no king, there is no monarchy, as a fight is brewing or is raging in Britain between those who want a monarchy and those who prefer Britain to be a republic, no king. Do you think Britain is really going to care what's going on in the colonies at this point in time? There's too much chaos going on for them to be concerned about trying to regulate colonial trade. They're just trying to keep their nation intact. There's a war going on, right? Now, this civil war ends in 1660. 20 years of civil war. The civil war ends in 1660. The royalists win. In other words, those who prefer a monarchy will win. A new king will be crowned. Charles II, son of the beheaded Charles, will become king. And it's just about this time then, 1660, with the restoration of the monarchy, that British businesses begin to appeal to the king and his government to please do something to regulate colonial trade. And they fear that way too much money is being lost to Britain by the colonists doing too much business with other foreign nations. Please, they said, please pass some kind of regulations and laws to regulate colonial commerce. And so Charles II and his parliament respond to this concern by British businesses by passing a set of laws that are known as the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts, laws to guide and control colonial trade and commerce. The first set of these laws were passed in 1660, another set in 1663, and remember that you don't need to obsess about dates and memorize those dates. But 1660 and 1663, and although the Navigation Acts will be modified from time to time over the next century, we need to note that the Navigation Acts will serve as the basic guidelines for colonial trade and commerce for the next 100 years. So, what were these laws about? There are three basic regulations of the Navigation Acts that we want to focus on. Number one, one of the first Navigation Acts deals with shipping to the colonies. Any trade done with the colonies had to be carried out in ships that were owned by British or colonial subjects. The ships had to be built in Britain or in British colonies, and 3/4 of the crew working those ships, taking goods to the colonies, had to be British or colonial. Okay. The British want full control of all shipping to the colonies. Right? They want the ships to have been built in Britain or the colonies. Ships needed to be owned by British people or colonial people. 3/4 of the crew working those ships had to be British or colonial citizens. Second, Navigation Acts required that certain products certain raw materials from the colonies could only be sold to British or other British colonial businesses. Certain raw materials that they grow in the colonies and the British colonies had to be sold only to British businesses or British colonial businesses. And these are some of the most important products grown in British America. We're talking about tobacco here. We're talking about sugar, cotton, ginger. You could only sell those raw materials to British businesses or to other British colonial businesses. Don't want it being sold off to France or Spain or the Netherlands, right, to enrich your competitors. And third Navigation Act required, it acknowledged the fact that Britain may not make everything that the colonies need. So any goods that are bound for sale in the colonies from another European nation, again like France or Spain or the Netherlands, those products had to first go to Britain. They first had to be shipped to Britain where they're going to be taxed. And then they were going to have to be shipped out to the colonies on ships that conformed to that first Navigation Act. British-owned, colonial-owned, right, etc. And that's to make sure that Britain gets some cut of the business that the colonists do have to do with other nations. If you make those products have to go to Britain first, you can levy a tax, you're going to get something out of this deal. And then you make sure that they're shipped to the colonies on ships that, again, are British or colonial. So that the profits, right, go to British businesses or colonial businesses. Even though we know the colonies have to buy some stuff from France or some stuff from Spain, Britain will get a cut of the action. And if you want to pause the video right now and jot these things down, that'd be cool. Which you can do throughout these videos, of course. Now, one thing I want to make sure you understand. There's nothing in these navigation acts that leads directly to the revolution and colonial independence. It's really easy to go, okay, well, the British, they made the colonists mad with the navigation acts, and that's what led to independence, and that's so wrong. Because these navigation acts, they were passed in the 1660s, right? Independence doesn't come until 1776. It's 100 years, right? So if you have any notion that the navigation acts lead directly to the revolution, get that out of your head right now. But these are the guidelines for colonial trade and commerce for about 100 years, from around 1660 to the 1770s, sorry. But they do not lead directly to independence. These are, however, the first regulations that Britain put into effect to try to deal with colonial commerce and make it conform to mercantilism. Problem is, the Americans don't seem to care much about these rules. Britain finally has put rules in place to regulate colonial trade, but the colonists regularly just ignore the regulations and they smuggle. They just go around the rules. They smuggle goods. Americans became famous for their ability to smuggle goods into the colonies and out of the colonies. They just kind of continued what they'd been doing before there were regulations in place at all. Now, this is not because the colonists could not be profitable if they followed the Navigation Acts. They could make money. It's just that they could make more money by smuggling. They can make more money by smuggling. I mean, for example, if you want to sell French lace in your store in Boston in the 1700s, for example, you could bring that lace in legally. Right? The lace would have to go to Britain, where it's going to get taxed and then reshipped to Boston in a ship that conforms to the Navigation Acts. You can still make a profit. But if you arrange for it to be smuggled into the colonies instead, not get taxed in Britain, then you're going to be able to be more competitive with the people who are doing it legally. Yeah, because any tax gets passed on to the consumer by way of a higher price. If you smuggled that lace in, you're going to be able to sell it at a lower price to the final consumer, and you're still going to make a nice profit. And you're going to be able to undersell the guy who did it legally. Smuggling just gave you a better chance to sell your product at probably a higher price. And since Britain didn't have any systems in place to really enforce the Navigation Acts, why not just smuggle? You know, you're probably going to get away with it. Nothing's probably going to happen to you. And so the Navigation Acts were basically ignored in the colonies. And this goes on for a good 30 years. It's not until 1696 that English businesses finally began to push Parliament to please figure out some way to enforce the Navigation Acts. British business was losing too much money from American smuggling. Please, they said, please figure out some way to make the Americans follow the rules. So in 1696, Parliament will try to take those steps to actually regulate colonial trade, to enforce, rather, the Navigation Acts. They're going to do that in a couple of ways. First, colonial governors are going to be given the responsibility of enforcing the Navigation Acts. Colonial governors were appointees of the king in the colonies. It's his job now to make sure that those Navigation Acts are being followed, or he could lose his position. And second, customs offices were established in each colony. The job of the customs agents is to search ships for smuggled goods going in or coming out. And if they catch smugglers, they can start the process by which those smugglers would be punished. So, with these two provisions now, Britain finally has the bureaucracy in place to control colonial commerce. But even though you've got someone now in charge of enforcing the Navigation Acts, even though now you've got these customs offices in place to find smugglers, enforcement was still pretty lax. Because it turns out that many of those customs agents didn't get their jobs because they were great at finding smugglers. They got those jobs because they knew somebody who could help them get the job. And a lot of those guys were corrupt. They were open to bribery. And a lot of American businesses who want to keep on smuggling, we're happy just to slip some cash under the table to the customs agents to overlook smuggling. You know, it's easy just to pay off these customs officials because, interestingly enough, those customs agents relied on the colonies for their pay. You know? As we're going to see shortly, it's a responsibility of the colonies to pay the king's representatives in America. Yeah, those customs agents officially are representatives of the king, but hey, you know, they're across an ocean over there in Britain. Who are you going to listen to? You can listen to some guy who had to send you a message on a boat that took 3 months to get there, or you're going to listen to the people who are willing to slip you a little bit of extra money to let the smuggling just continue on. This system didn't work. And so we see that during the first 100 or so years of the colony's existence, 150 years, the colonial economic activities either are not regulated at all, or they are loosely regulated, with punishments being fairly rare for violations of the rules. And so over that 150 years, the colonies develop a sense of freedom when it comes to their economy. Oh yeah, there are rules in place, but we just ignore them. Very few people actually get fined or punished. We feel free when it comes to our economic activity. We can get away with smuggling. We feel free. We run our economy the way we want to. And there's another sense of freedom that develops in colonial America as well. Because over those 150 years of colonial existence, as we've noted, every one of those colonies was self-governed. Every one of those colonies elected a legislature that made the laws for the colony. And over time, 3 very specific rights and powers came to be in control in the colonies. Number 1, the colonies have the power to control the salaries of the king's representatives in America. Again, that's like the colonial governor or the customs agents. If you have the power of the purse over the king's representatives in the colonies, you have a lot of power over those people. As we noted, you know, colonists are paying those customs agents. Why would they listen to somebody way far off away in England? Shouldn't they be listening to the guy who actually pays them their paycheck and is willing to bribe them to ignore the smuggling? Power to control the salaries of the king's representatives in America. Second, the colonies have the right to control their own elections. Nobody from Britain tells them how to run their elections. Nobody monitors their elections. Nobody tells them how, you know, what criteria to use in how to choose representatives in their colonial legislatures. The colonies have the full right to control their own elections. And most importantly, I think, to our story to come in the second video, the colonies also have the power to tax themselves for revenue, operating funds, and to spend that tax revenue as they see fit. Nobody from Britain taxed Americans, only their colonial legislatures that the colonists elected had the right to tax them for money to run those colonies with, and only the colonies had the right to determine how they spend that money. So over that 150 years or so then of the colony's existence, the colonies exercised a degree of self-government without interference from Britain. They controlled the salaries of the king's representatives. They controlled their own elections. They had the power to tax themselves for revenue and spend that revenue as they see fit. They feel free. They feel free. They come to believe that Britain should never interfere in their elections or their taxation or in their right to control the salaries of the king's representatives in America. They believe that these are basic rights due them as subjects of the British Empire. Americans feel free. Their economic life was either not regulated or loosely regulated, and they enjoyed a certain independence in governing their colonies. Now again, this relationship between Britain and the colonies is not perfect. And and there are things about it that the Americans don't like, and there are things about it that the British don't like. But it's not going to change, really, until after a war that started in 1755 and ended in 1763. So let's take a look at that war. We want to understand that Britain is not the only European nation that is colonizing in North America. We've already spoken about the Spanish Empire, the Spanish colonies in Central and South America. We should understand that France also has a pretty big chunk of territory in North America as well. In the 1700s, France had established control over a great deal of land, as you can see on the map, spreading from the Rocky Mountains down to New Orleans, just right up next door to the British colonies on the coast, and all the way up into the areas that we today know as Canada, the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. We need to understand that the French, they don't have a lot of French people living in New France, but they're pretty prosperous because the French colonists established businesses in things like trapping and trading in furs, things that were very valuable in Europe. And they did so with the cooperation of the native peoples in the regions that they controlled. The Spanish, you remember, they enslaved the people that they conquered in South and Central America. The Americans, the British colonists, tended to fight with them, try to kill them off. But the French went into business with natives. They developed relationships, friendships with natives. Many French colonists married native women. They have a good, strong, and workable relationship with the native peoples in their areas, and thus with the alliance of natives in New France, they are quite prosperous. Now we want to note that over the course of the 1700s, however, there will be various wars that break out between Britain and France for dominance and power. Those wars were fought mainly in Europe. But every time there was a war between Britain and France in Europe, some of the fighting would spread to North America as French colonists would skirmish with English colonists. But it never made a lot of difference. The fighting in North America was never as important as the fighting in Europe. Again, as France and Britain duked it out in a sense to see who's number one. However, in the war that we're just about to talk about, this war that begins in 1755, is going to be a very different war altogether. And at the end of this war, the relationship between Britain and its North American colonies will begin to change pretty dramatically. The war is called the French and Indian War. In America, in Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. But from the very beginning, this war was different from all of the other wars that France and Europe had fought previously. All those other wars, they started in Europe and spread to the colonies. And the fighting in Europe was the most important part of it, the decisive parts of the wars. But this French and Indian War is going to begin in North America and spread to Europe. And as we're going to see, the most important part of that fighting, the war, will be in America, not in Europe. So let's see how it begins. If you take a look at this map, you're going to notice the red areas belong to Britain, primarily these 13 colonies, plus a business, essentially, that the Hudson Bay Company that kind of operates out of northern Canada. But you've got your 13 colonies here. France here, remember we have a great deal of territory, New France, all the way through here to the Rocky Mountains. And then you've also got territory that's disputed territory. You've got this area, the striped areas are areas that are kind of being fought over by the British and the French for control and dominance. The French and Indian War started here. In 1755, a Virginia militiaman tried to establish a fort, an outpost, in what is now western Pennsylvania, and they were challenged by the French, challenged by French colonists. Right? Remember, it's disputed territory. Those Virginia militiamen were under the command of Major George Washington, and they lose badly. The French ran them out of the area. So the British colonies asked Britain to please send over some British troops to help them to secure this territory, and the British will send over a few troops, a couple of hundred. But they're beaten constantly. The British and the Americans cannot seem to keep the French out of this disputed territory that Britain would like to control. And at one point in this war, after the first couple of years, it looked like the French were going to be able to take control of all of those British colonies on the east coast of North America. The British and the Americans are defeated constantly. It looked very much like Britain might lose those eastern colonies to the French. At this point, however, we're going to see a new minister of war put in place by the British government. His name was William Pitt. And William Pitt saw this war in America in a very different way than his predecessors had seen the wars between Britain and France previously. Previously, as we noted, the British always believed that the fighting in Europe was more important than the fighting in America. And the fighting that had broken out in America did indeed spread to the European continent, as the British and the French were fighting it out at the same time that the French and Indian War was going on in America. Pitt, however, takes a look at this particular war and he says, you know what? What we do in Europe is not as important as what we need to do in America. Pitt's philosophy is that defeating the French in America is more important than defeating them in Europe. Pitt thinks that he might even have a chance to take over parts of New France if he can defeat the French in America. Maybe even get France off the continent of North America altogether. So to try to make that happen, Pitt is going to hire German mercenary troops, soldiers for hire, right? Send those German mercenary troops into Europe to fight the French for the British, and thus free up the British army to come to America to fight the French and their Indian allies. Hire German mercenary troops to take the place of British troops fighting the French in Europe. Send more of the British army to America now to fight the French and their Indian allies. This is expensive. Those mercenary troops are not cheap. And you're also now going to have to come up with the money to send so much of the British Army to America. This is a very expensive proposition. And Pitt would have been within his rights to ask the colonies to chip in some money for this effort, to get the colonial legislatures to tax the colonial citizens to help pay for this endeavor. Because after all, I mean, they're fighting to defend the British colonists in America. They're fighting the French to keep the French from taking over. But that would have taken a lot of time. That means Pitt was going to have to probably send representatives to every one of those 13 colonies to convince them to tax their citizens to pay for the war. And there's no guarantee that the legislatures would have even agreed. So Pitt decides, no, I'm not going to be able to get that money from the colonies. We're going to have to pay for this completely out of the British treasury ourselves. So they go deep, deep into the British reserves. They're going to end up having to borrow money. They're going to go deeply into debt. But it worked. I'm not going to go into the details of the war. I never go into details of war. I'm not a military historian. But what we want to understand is that when the British Army reaches North America and can begin now to fight the French and their Indian allies, the British will be quite successful. The British will take control of important settlements in what is now Canada, Quebec, Montreal, been through here. And although the war will drag on for a few more years after this is done, once the war is over completely in America and in Europe, the British have defeated the French. As a result of that French defeat, then the map of North America changes dramatically. You see the pre-war boundaries here in 1754. Look at those boundaries in 1763. You've got your 13 British colonies here, but you also see that, that a lot of what was New France now belongs to the British. Florida, which had been Spanish, is also turned over to the British because Spain came into the war in Europe on France's side. And so when France loses, Spain does too, they had to give up their colony of Florida to the British as a result. Now, France still had the colony they call Louisiana, all the way to the Rocky Mountains, all the way out through here. But they're going to end up giving that colony to Spain. To compensate them for their loss of Florida. So we have a whole new map now to look at. The British control a whole lot more territory in North America than they had before. The Spanish have increased their holdings as well. But France, they're gone. France no longer has any territory in North America. The French no longer have claims to territory in North America. This is important. And so this war came to an end in 1763. If I ever wanted you to memorize dates, this would be a date that I care about. But again, we're not memorizing dates. But 1763 is the year that the relationship between Britain and its colonies will now begin to change because of the French and Indian War. The king is George III. George and his government realized that they have just spent a whole lot of money and gone into a whole lot of debt to fight a long war to protect the colonists from the French. And they had succeeded. But they had incurred a huge debt in the process. Nevertheless, France no longer threatened British colonies in America. France was out of the backyard of the American colonists, so to speak. And King George in Parliament reasoned that the colonists owed Britain something for this. I mean, it seems reasonable for them to decide that the colonies should help to reimburse Britain for some of the cost of that war, should help them to pay the debt. I mean, the war was fought to protect the colonies. And the British national debt had doubled to protect the colonies from the French. You know, France is no longer on the North American continent. Surely it makes sense that the colonies should help Britain pay off that debt, doesn't it? I mean, they've got a point. But what we're going to see is those feelings of independence that had been evolving for 150 years, economic independence, political independence, going to kind of get in the way of the colony's attempts to recoup some of the money to help pay down their debts. This war came to an end in 1763. Within 12 years, fighting will have broken out between Britain and the colonists. And in 1776, the Declaration of Independence is the formal break of these colonies from their mother country. So in the next lecture, the next video, we're going to take a look at the defining events between 1763 and 1776, the road to the American Revolution, the major events that will occur as we see as we see the British colonies pushing back and deciding to separate from Britain. So I'll leave it there, and we'll take a look at the next one as we prepare for our first exam.